Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Creating Space. My name is Scott Lackey. I'm the host of this podcast, and we are here to create space for hopefully compelling conversations surrounding Christianity and faith, and be able to ask some difficult questions and grow together. So if you follow along, thank you for being a part of the conversation here at Creating Space. If there's a subject that you'd like to hear us talk about, please send me an email to scottlackey@newstorybuffalo.com. I'd love to be able to dive into any subjects of interest to you as we continue to seek to create space for people to be able to ask difficult questions or questions that they've always had on their mind so that we can continue to grow together. And today's a really exciting day. We have a special guest on the podcast with us. Today, joining us, we have Professor Scot McKnight. Dr. McKnight has been my professor for a number of years now. It has been a thrill and an honor to get to know him and to be able to learn under him. And he's one of those people who he talks and studies a lot about Jesus and the Gospels and the New Testament, but he also walks in that character as well, that character of Christ-likeness. So it has been a true honor to be able to learn from him. If you're unfamiliar with Dr. McKnight and his work, Scott has been a professor of New Testament for more than 4 decades. He is the author of more than 90 books, including the award-winning The Jesus Creed, as well as the King Jesus Gospel and the Blue Parakeet, and some projects that were recently released from his. He's currently been working on the Everyday Bible Studies, and I believe his most recent release in that is on the Gospel of Matthew.
That's right.
Yeah, there it is, the Gospel of Matthew. And you also recently released a book, Invisible Jesus, a book for those who are deconstructing and walking away from church, and I think also a book for those who are not deconstructing, but a plea for people to maybe understand those who are deconstructing. Would that be an appropriate way of characterizing that?
That's a good summary of what we have attempted to accomplish in Invisible Jesus. Yeah.
That's great. Are there before we dive into this, any projects on the horizon right now that you're excited about?
Well, yes, I am excited. I've been working on a book for quite a while on Jesus and the Pharisees, several years, and it's getting near completion. I'm writing a book with a trauma therapist on the traumatized apostle, which is about the Apostle Paul, focusing on 2 Corinthians 10 to 13. And let's see, I'm working with Lucy Pepiot on a book on Jesus and women. So, and all those 3 books will all be done by June, and then I'll be working on a commentary on Matthew, and I'm not ready to announce who that's with yet.
So in other words, you're not slowing down anytime soon.
Not slowing down. That's right.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's really a privilege to have you here. I'm excited for our audience to get to know you a little bit. I know you have a lot of moving pieces, as you just shared, a number of books in the works right now, and you're a professor as well. And I see you're traveling and speaking. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, Scott, it's good to be with you. And as always, I've enjoyed our times in the past. And I think we're going to enjoy this time today, too.
I think so, too. We have a interesting subject for today. I was thinking through, because I've read so many of your books. I'm currently reading Romans backwards. I've been deeply impacted by a lot of your work, and I was thinking, I'm bringing Scott on Creating Space. What can we talk about? And sometimes what we talk about on the podcast has to do with a recent experience that I've had. It kind of gets me thinking, well, I want to talk about that now. So I'll either come on and monologue about it or have a guest on to discuss the subject. And this specific subject today, we're going to be talking about what is now referred to as the new perspective on Paul. And what got me wanting to talk about this was a conversation I was having with a local pastor recently. And he said to me that the new perspective on Paul came from a group of uninspired men in the 1980s who just wanted to say that the Apostle Paul was mistaken or something like that. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a mischaracterization on the new perspective on Paul. And I thought, who better than to come on Creating Space and give us a little bit of a background on what the new perspective on Paul is, what it's all about. I always find it fascinating in class, Scott, when you share how you were around for the origins of the new perspective and you got to watch this thing blossom.
Sir.
Yeah. So as we start talking about this, let's set the record straight about how this is not just a group of uninspired men who got Paul wrong, but this was actually something much different than that. And I'd love to hear a little bit of history of the new perspective. You were there in the mix. What was going on? What was happening?
Okay, this is a good question because people don't understand that. I don't know why anybody would call it uninspired. If they're talking about the doctrine of Scripture, of course, but they're probably not. But at any rate, maybe uninspiring for them. All right, in 1977, E.P. Sanders wrote a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. When he wrote that book, it was like a 50 years, 60 years after a great book and study by a guy named George Foot Moore. George Foot Moore, who wrote a book about Judaism. He's a Christian, a 3-volume book. And he had also written a book, I think it was called Christian Writers on Jews and Judaism. Something like that. It was a long journal article. Well, Sanders updated that and reworked it in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls and his expertise. And what he did to begin with was to demolish the German Lutheran perception of Judaism as a works-based religion in which you have to pile up merits on the basis of following the law in order to enter into the Olam Haba, which is the Hebrew word or Hebrew expression for the age to come. So Sanders redefined Judaism. When he looked at his redefined Judaism, he realized that the opponents of Paul had changed. They were no longer Jews who were seeking to be righteous on the basis of their own merit, but they were Jews who were, in a sense, living in a BC era when an AD era had arrived. So Sanders made the famous statement that the problem with Judaism was that it wasn't Christianity. All right. So it wasn't that the problem was works righteousness. Now, Scott, here's something. Okay. There's a lot going on in my head right now. Sanders writes this book but he didn't do anything about the new perspective. He wrote a book on Judaism and then reinterpreted Paul in what he called participationist eschatology. He was adjusting the work of Albert Schweitzer, a German, on Paul. But both, and at virtually the same time, James D.G. Dunn, Jimmy Dunn, and N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, began to write about Paul in light of E.P. Sanders. And Jimmy Dunn gave a famous set of lectures at Manchester University in England just before I had gone to England and before the essay had been published. And he called it the new perspective on Paul. And he did not mean the new perspective. He just meant this is a new perspective on Paul that we need to start taking into consideration. He wasn't giving it the title, the new perspective. Only later did they realize that Tom Wright, like a year before, maybe 2 years before, I think it was a year before, had written an essay in which he mentioned the new perspective, a new perspective on Paul. So they both, in a sense, get credit for the expression new perspective, but really it was Jimmy Dunn's essay in which he announced the new perspective on Paul that took off. Okay. Sanders saw Paul in terms of participationist eschatology, and Sanders is at the foundation of the new perspective, the apocalyptic Paul, the Paul within Judaism, the grace perspective. All of contemporary scholarship on Paul has to go through E.P. Sanders. Those who don't go back to Calvin, and Luther and Augustine, which, are not lightweights. And that is often referred to now as the old perspective because of the new perspective. But actually, it is I think a better accurate way of saying it would say it's the Reformation perspective on Paul, the Protestant perspective on Paul that has become a part of the system of how scholars and pastors preach the Apostle Paul. So it was E.P. Sanders who gave birth to early essays and works by Jimmy Dunn and N.T. Wright. He also gave rise to people who did apocalyptic theology, which, in its biggest form right now would be Douglas Campbell and Beverly Gaventa. And he gave the opportunity for Michael Gorman to create his participationist eschatology, which is different than E.P. Sanders, but similar. And also the Paul within Judaism school of thought, say Martin Anos and Magnus Zetterholm. And then also, I was just thinking of someone else. I can't think of it right now. But, all these views have come as a result of E.P. Sanders' refashioning of Judaism. The single difference between the old perspective, if you want to call it that, and the new perspective is a new perspective on Judaism. John Barclay, the grace perspective. He too goes to E.P. Sanders. So all these views are dependent upon the important contributions, and they don't agree with everything that E.P. Sanders said, but they all go through Sanders, except mostly the people in the old perspective more or less disagree with what Sanders said about Judaism.
And this then has implications for how you read Paul, and even, as we'll get to in a moment, how you look at the Gospels as well. Because if Judaism is not just this monolithic, works-based, to get the salvation idea that maybe the old perspective or the Reformed perspective would suggest, then that opens up a variety of ways of interpreting some key factors and ideas, correct?
Yeah. Now, here's an interesting, there was a dissertation published just a few years ago. The last name of the scholar, I'm pretty sure, is Thomas. I could look it up for you if you want. He studied largely second and third century Christianity, and he argued that the new perspective of Jimmy Dunn is actually older than the old perspective that relied on Augustine in the 4th and 5th century. So, in other words, he found that in the 2nd century texts, their understanding of Paul's critique of Judaism was very similar to what Jimmy Dunn proposed in his seminal essays in the 80s and 90s.
Well, now you're getting into an interesting point as well, as we talk a little bit about considering a different perspective or things like, so for example, I know in my own life, one of my critiques, for example, of dispensationalism is, oh, this is a relatively new idea. It came along in the 19th century, but then somebody could just as easily say, well, Scott, you follow the new perspective. That's a new idea, but there's a big difference in the starting point of a belief like dispensationalism versus the new perspective, to the degree that dispensationalism more so is, and maybe I'm misrepresenting here, you can obviously correct me, but dispensationalism is more so, oh, this is just some guy's kind of random idea and reinterpretation of scripture, possibly based off of a vision, while the new perspective is based off of information that we now have about the first century and the world in which Paul and Jesus lived. We now have to reconsider some things that we once thought. So it's more so based off of history than just more so kind of I don't mean to be disrespectful, but kind of a random idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I wouldn't say random either. I know you're hesitant about that. The key thing is that dispensationalism, as it is now understood, or was understood, classic dispensationalism, arose out of John Nelson Darby in Plymouth, England, and he was an Irishman who was okay. So it it was it was a populist view by a guy who couldn't read Greek and Hebrew the way he should have had to do it, and didn't know anything about the Jewish texts of apocalyptic, etc. And he put together a scheme that had the capacity to speak to ordinary Christians in their context and give them sort of a history, an understanding of what's happening in the world. And in that sense, dispensationalism was genius, is that it gave people a hermeneutic to comprehend life and where history's going. It has always been wrong in its predictions. And this is no small issue to me, but okay, that's not the only thing. But dispensationalism then was popularized in the United States through Cyrus Scofield from Philadelphia, and then through Moody Bible Institute, then especially through Dallas Seminary, when they had Louis Sperry Chafer writing systematic theology, gave rise to people like J.D. Pentecost, who wrote Things to Come, gave rise to John Walvoord, who was a professor there, very popular. And then dispensationalists got into debates with people like George Eldon Ladd in the United States, and it started to crack. And eventually, even professors at Dallas Seminary modified classic dispensationalism into what Darrell Bach and he's got a co-author. I don't know his co-author. They call it progressive dispensationalism. In other words, it's been adjusted. But what has been argued is that seeds of some of the major ideas in dispensationalism can be found in the early fathers. They all believe, everybody believes that their view goes back to the New Testament. So anybody who argues that this is, let's just say, a new idea, that's completely mistaken. This is not some random hillbillies standing on a corner barking out brand new ideas. That's not what this is. This is genuine scholars, in most cases, who go back to the text of the New Testament in its Jewish and early Christian world and exegete it more carefully. And then out of that forms a theology.
Now, you're speaking of you're speaking of the new perspective there, correct?
And the old perspective and the and the apocalyptic Paul, all of them think that they're going back to the New Testament. It's not something new. So the accusation that these things are new. Now, it is true to say that the secret rapture of the church is almost certainly a 19th, 20th century idea that wasn't held by the church that way at all until then. However, they think it comes out of 1 Corinthians 4:13. And okay, so now you got your problem. It's a New Testament debate. So I don't like the argument that it's a brand new idea on anyone's part. I do not generally use that argument. I do think the way it's been framed can be fresh and new, and it can be 20th century, it can be 21st century. But the question that we ask as New Testament scholars is, what is the evidence in the New Testament for this set of ideas? And we have to check it. That's where I think we need to go. That's the major accusation. It doesn't fit the New Testament is the most significant argument of all.
Well, that leads us to some interesting places as well with a new perspective. And you're saying it doesn't fit the New Testament. I think a big piece of that would come down to the conversation surrounding justification. And this was obviously a big deal about 20 years ago when two very prominent voices had a back and forth about this subject. Would that be an accurate portrayal of one of the conversations that has really caused this new perspective to rattle some people's cages?
Well, Scott, here's the problem with yes, it is true that Tom Wright and John Piper went toe to toe, nose to nose on justification. And I have paid attention to this discussion. And because I have taught Galatians, I used to teach Galatians almost every year when I taught at Trinity back in the 80s and mid 90s to mid 90s. I could never quite figure out who believed what and why justification was such a big issue, except for this. Justification in the, let's say, the Reformation perspective is the shifting of the righteousness of Christ to the righteousness of a human being who believes, so that they now are in a position of being right. They're righteous positionally. That's an old category.
Mm-hmm.
And it fits into a scheme developed by John Murray called Redemption, something and Applied. Defined, I'm not sure. And he was a Reformed theologian, a very important book. And it gets into it's called the Ordo Salutis, election, calling, and then it gets into justification, then sanctification and glorification. So it orders how everything happens. And justification is this, let's say Romans 5, and sanctification is Romans 3 through 5 is justification. And some people say 1 through 5. And then 6 to 8 is sanctification. And so they get into these categories. And I think that the idea of the imputation of Christ's righteousness to us, which D.A. Carson, who was quite a critic of the New Perspective, has said about justification, that there is no unambiguous text in the New Testament that teaches that Christ's righteousness has been imputed to us. And he thinks it's based on hints and suggestions, and that it makes sense of the New Testament information. I was at the lecture when Don Carson gave that lecture at the Wheaton Theology Conference way back, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And it was published in a book, and I think it was a book on justification. It could have been The Glory of Atonement, but I think it was on and Bob Gundry had given a paper just prior to that in which he said that's not what happens in the New Testament. That idea is not there. But that's the idea of justification. It is that we are guilty and that our sin is transferred to Christ and his righteousness is transferred to us. And Tom Wright made statements. You can't transfer righteousness the way you transfer gas from one tube to another. He actually, in a public setting in the United States, said, well, you can't pass gas like that. Oh. I mean, everybody in the room was laughing, and he had realized he had used a little bit of a funny expression in the United States. But the other side of this is the New Perspective recognizes that justification is making people right. So they both, and there was lots of debates among New Perspective people. They didn't all agree. Tom Wright kind of had a view that he distinguished it from salvation. Jimmy Dunn made some statements that he corrected, and over time, his view got closer to in a sense, the old Perspective view. But they all now would admit that it is forensic. It is a judgment that God makes, but it is also transformative in that it not only is positional, but it is also practical. Justification is not only that you have been declared right, but that you have been redeemed and regenerated in a way that you now start to walk according to the will of God. And then it gets into the law and all these debates as well. So I do think that this is a big issue in the discussion, in the New Perspective, Old Perspective. But sometimes the categories being used are, let's say, caricatures of the other side rather than a careful sifting of the options and the evidence being used and the history of the discussion itself from, let's just say, 77 all the way through 2025. And then I think you will see that there's a greater overlap in their what they actually think salvifically when it comes to justification than there is a bold contrast. Notice this, that a friend of mine, Joe Modica, and I have co-edited 2 books on preaching the book of Romans. All right. One of the things that I thought would happen is that we would recognize that people, when they get down to the meaning of terms like justification, will all be using the terms the same way. And I think if you look at these sermons, you will realize that the overlap is so significant that justification is not the primary issue. It's only systematic theologians in the Reformed tradition who have such a intense calculus, and I mean this in a positive way, a scholasticism about their understanding of justification, that see things that nobody else seems to care about in the other schools. So they just say things that fit in the Reformed camp as well. All right, that's my perspective. I'm no specialist on justification. And if you had Mike Bird in here, Mike Bird might say that justification is the single issue. He wrote on this in a Paternoster monograph series, and he worked on defining justification. But it just seems when it comes down to it, these people are all pretty similar.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. I've found that in some of my conversations with my more reformed friends at times. There's certain things I'm trying to emphasize and they're trying to emphasize. And then we say to one another, hey, we're actually not that different. There might just be some differences, perhaps in some slight differences in what is emphasized, but it's also what's emphasized in the life of a Christian, not necessarily in like you were saying, salvation per se. I think that's
now the other side of this is that if there's any major difference, well, one thing that should be factored into it is that the old perspective tends to be very individualistic. It's about what happens to an individual Christian. Mm-hmm. Whereas with the new perspective, it's more about the church. It's more about the collective rather than just the individual. And that can turn into some kind of reified, exaggerated difference that in the living reality, when they start preaching sermons, they're not that far apart.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I've heard Mike Bird say before that in the new perspective, the key thing with justification is there's both a vertical and a horizontal emphasis.
Yeah.
And
sure.
Yeah. And obviously the place to reference there would be Galatians 2:15 through 21, which could possibly be Paul's response to Peter, potentially of inclusion into the family of God and those types of things.
Yeah.
And I think I heard Michael Gorman say one time that we just want to make sure that we don't treat justification as if it is the real McCoy, and sanctification is some kind of just, this is a little add-on that might be in the Christian life. But in his participationist model, he kind of sees them as all together.
Yeah, that's a Wesleyan perspective. A guy named Peter Toon, who was alive and well in England when I was a PhD student in England, wrote a book that showed that these terms overlap significantly. So virtually my entire academic career, I've believed that it's artificial to separate, let's say, election, regeneration, justification, sanctification. I think that these things overlap with one another. They're different terms with a different emphasis on the same reality of God's gracious work of redemption in the life of a human being and the people of God.
So one of the things you might be saying then, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I'm an average churchgoer and I, for years, was more so influenced by a reformed setting and I go to a new church and the pastor is saying some things about justification that might sound a little bit different. And you find out, oh, this is more so in line with a new perspective. I don't need to be too concerned or get too worked up about it.
This is an interesting issue, and yes, I think you're right. But yet, lay people can be radars for differences, and those radars, they can have these radars that make them ask questions. You think, what in the world are they asking about? But they came from another tradition where sanctification, in a sense, was an option.
Mm-hmm.
And justification was the real McCoy. I think you said Mike Gorman said that. And then they hear that justification is that now they're going to say, are you Roman Catholic? And this was the argument early. I heard this frequently about Tom Wright. It's just a Roman Catholic view of justification. Then Pope Benedict wrote a book on Paul in the year of Paul, whatever it was, 2000th year of Paul or something. And he had a whole thing, and I thought, I think this is pretty good. And so the old term that they used in polemics was Protestants, Reformation. They used the imputation of righteousness, which is a legal fiction in some level. It's a practical fiction. And the Roman Catholics believed in the impartation of righteousness, is that it started to make people right. And I think if you think justification does nothing to you, it's impossible to square that with Jewish belief at the time that Paul would have said that. So imputation without impartation is a reductionism, and impartation without imputation, as long as you generalize what imputation means, is also a reductionism.
That's good. That's a good distinguishing idea there. As we're continuing through here, just a couple more questions. What would you say is a distinguishing factor of the new perspective when reading Paul and with reading Jesus?
Well, with Paul, of course, it all comes down to his theory of justification and sanctification, if you want to separate the terms. It's his soteriology. Jesus just doesn't go there. Jesus doesn't talk about justification, in spite of what John Piper one time said. He's on the basis of Luke's parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Fortunately, I'm putting words in his mouth. He didn't say this. Jesus talks about justification because the tax collector went home justified. So Jesus does talk about justification. So good for Jesus. He's on our team. Well, that's the only time he talks about. Because in the Jewish world, the Hebrew word, tzedakah, and what we translate as dikaio in Paul, and becomes justification or just or right or righteousness, all those terms. In the Jewish world, it described behavior that conforms to the will of God as taught by Jesus. That is someone who possesses the righteousness of the kingdom. And when I would read at that time, when I was working on Matthew so hard in my dissertation, and I would read people on Paul and think, you guys are so far from what Jesus actually said that I think you got to be wrong about Paul. Some people would make Jesus fit into Paul. I'm saying, if Paul doesn't fit into Jesus, he's wrong. All right. So to me, when Jesus says, unless your righteousness greatly surpasses or goes well beyond the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, that righteousness there is not imputed stuff. That righteousness is following the will of God as taught by Jesus. It's kingdom ethics. And that would mean that for Jesus, righteousness has fundamentally a behavioral status. It's about people who do what God says. Now, then you could back off of this and start talking about, did Jesus believe in regeneration? Well, The only time he uses a word like this is pertaining to the future. So no, he doesn't do that. Does he talk about election? Well, he's a Jew. He has to at some level. Um, does he talk about calling and not like the reformers did? So those terms don't fit Jesus. But when you look at what Jesus is saying, and you see that he is saying that those who follow him, followers, I say it this way. It sounds like it's redundant, but it's not. Followers of Jesus follow Jesus. Okay? If you don't follow Jesus, you're not a follower of Jesus. In other words, if you don't do what he says, if you're not a practitioner of the ethic of Jesus, you're not a follower. So for Jesus, that's what salvation means, is to be connected to him and to follow him. Paul believes that grace is a transformative thing that makes us agents of God's will in this world. So if you start saying you can be saved without works, you can't square your idea with Jesus or with Paul. So let's say this, the new perspective simply accepts the language of Jesus about righteousness as entirely consistent with the way Jews talked about righteousness in their world. The new perspective recognizes that Paul adjusted that term and gave it a new sense of something that God does in us by, let's say, imputing or declaring us to be the right people of God, declaring us to be right.
Hmm.
So Paul is the one who adjusts a Jewish term. He gave a fresh coin to an old Jewish category.
I can hear a little bit of the words of Bonhoeffer going off in my mind right now. I'm going to paraphrase here. This is not word for word what he said, but something like the doctrine or the belief of cheap grace has done far more damage to the church than any doctrine of good works.
That's totally right.
And
He didn't say, but he talked about cheap grace a lot. Cheap grace is baptism without repentance, something like that. Yeah.
but at the same time, okay, let's go back to the context of lay people where we read a few moments ago. You might be hearing something like this and saying, this sounds a little different than what I've heard before. Yes, someone who follows Jesus, I get that. But how can I know that I'm saved? Because that's where it comes down to for a lot of listeners and a lot of people who are in the church. And it's, well, okay, you're saying righteousness that exceeds, you're saying a changed life, a transformed life. That's somewhat consistent, but I think that's where the disconnect comes in for a lot of people.
Okay. Three guys connected to Asbury Seminary wrote a book about this not too long ago. And it's a pretty good book, but here's the way I'd put it. Every judgment scene in the New Testament is a judgment scene based on works. No judgment scene is based on, did you accept Jesus into your heart? The problem is that evangelical Christians have embraced the idea that they can accept Christ and not genuinely and consistently follow Jesus or follow the teachings of the New Testament. And they want to be assured that they're going to go to heaven when they die because they made a decision to accept Christ in their heart or because they got baptized. And that flies in the face of every author in the New Testament and every gospel, Paul, James, Hebrews, 1 John, they all teach that followers of Jesus follow Jesus. Those who don't follow Jesus are not followers of Jesus. So the issue here is they want to be assured on the basis of a decision. I don't think the New Testament has any problem with the sense of assurance. Romans 8 is a glorious explosion of confidence and consolation and exhortation and assurance by the Apostle Paul. that if God is at work in us, God will complete this work. It's not based on us, but we cannot expect to be finally saved if we are not people who are fit for the kingdom of God.
No.
So C.S. Lewis was right when he made that clever statement. Hell is locked from the inside, not the outside. So it's people who decide that they don't want to follow Jesus. They're the ones. But assurance in the New Testament is nowhere near as emphasized as it is in evangelicalism. And I grew up in that world where it was constant, is that if you have prayed this prayer, you have genuinely accepted Jesus into your heart, then you're going to go to heaven when you die. Well, this is why the kids that I grew up with all got saved multiple times.
Because me too.
As they got a little bit older, they thought, well, maybe I didn't really accept God. I fell away, or what? I was a backslider. But so they made, our standard language was we rededicated our life to Christ.
Yep.
But actually, we never really dedicated our life to Christ. So it wasn't a rededication. But that's all rooted in that single moment sense that if you've done the right thing, you can be fully assured. The New Testament is not going to give us that kind of consolation. The consolation, and I went through a very difficult period of struggle with this when I was a college freshman and sophomore. I had a really good college professor named Joe Crawford who said to me, you need to just accept the fact that God loves you, that you are in Christ, and you just need to move forward. I read some essays by a famous Plymouth Brethren, published by Loazo Brothers, called CHM. His last name was McIntosh. All right. And he had a volume on the all-sufficiency of Christ. And this book saved me in that sense. It taught me that I need to get my eyes off of whether I've done enough and get my eyes on Christ who has done enough. And the more time I spend time with Christ, who is all sufficient, I will be more assured. And that's what happened to me right there.
I had a similar story. I was trained up in this fundamentalist Christian camp, made a decision even when I was a staff member to keep following Christ. I was on staff, I was always scared of hell. And I, by accident, in January of 2013, I'll never forget it. So this is 12 years ago now, by accident, picked up a copy of N.T. Wright's Simply Jesus. And it changed my life. It changed my life of who Jesus was, what his vision was for the world, how he saw his created beings. And it started me on a track of falling in love with Jesus and saying, I genuinely want to follow him. That's who I want to follow, not live in this state of paranoia. One last question here. I know we got to get moving. Thank you so much for your time. And then I'll do a few fun rapid fire questions. But the big question before rapid fire, before the fun stuff is there any one great misunderstanding as it relates to the new perspective on Paul that you would like to? I'm not saying you're the mouthpiece for the new perspective per se, but if there was a misunderstanding you'd like to clear the air on, you're saying this is it.
Well, okay. All right. I want to say this. The New Perspective's emphasis that Judaism was not a works-based religion so that you could earn sufficient merit with God to be saved is totally mistaken. The misunderstanding to me, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to the critics of the New Perspective. I really don't, because I'm more of a Gospels guy. I spend my time there, and I listen to these debates, and I think, I don't have to settle this. Someone else will settle this. Mike Bird will settle this. He'll get into it. He'll write a book about this tomorrow night. I think that it teaches, let's say, a works-based righteousness, or that teaches what Tim Keller called it religion. instead of grace, or that it has a weak theology of grace. I think these are deeply mistaken, and these are slurs against people like Tom Wright and Jimmy Dunn and even E.P. Sanders, who wasn't the same kind of person. I mean, the same kind of, he wasn't in the camp with Dunn and Wright. I think these are mostly slurs, rather than genuine critical perspective on what they had to say.
Yeah, you can kind of tell too if somebody's actually read what somebody has had to say too.
I mean, I cannot tell you the number of scholars, New Testament scholars, that I've met, and I've said, "Have you actually read E.P. Sanders, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, or E.P. Sanders, Judaism, Practice and Belief? Have you actually read Jimmy Dunn or N.T. Wright's, let's say, Paul and the Faithfulness of God?" And they haven't. They're just living with stereotypes of talking points that they've heard,
Yep.
rather than actually read them. All of these scholars are nuanced, and it takes a lot of time to read them and understand them. But once you understand them, you will not be saying the things that people are saying about
No, I completely, and this is, as a pastor, this is a conversation I have a lot with people. It's just the world we live in where people come to me, Scott, you quoted this person. Did you hear this or that? And I'll say, have you ever read a book by that person? And the
it.
answer is almost always no. So it's not just the scholarly world, it's the everyday world.
Yeah,
We're being trained in a soundbite world. And I think what's so funny about it, not to dissect all of this, but what's so funny about it is the evangelical culture is get to know Jesus for yourself, grow your own personal relationship with Jesus. It's not about your pastor or your leader, it's about you and Jesus. But then as soon as somebody goes off to develop this me and Jesus thing and do some reading, if the reading is outside of the bounds of the construct that's been given to them, it's no, don't do that anymore.
No, I agree. And that's what I was telling you about radars, is lay people have radars for differences. And they do perceive them, and they'll go, that's not what I've been taught. The problem is they think they're right, and that anything that's different from that is really dangerous. And that's where they make their bigger mistake.
Right.
It's not dangerous. It's not dangerous. These people are not dangerous.
Right.
So,
and that's where I've had to grow in my grace and understanding of, hey, this is what someone has been discipled in, so let's walk in this together. And it's it can be challenging at times.
Yeah. Oh, very.
Let's do a quick rapid fire round. Let's let the people get to know Scot McKnight a little bit today. What is your all-time favorite movie? I know this much. I was on a flight with you, and it's not the Elvis movie because I told you to watch it, and you couldn't even get through it. So what is your all-time favorite movie?
Grease.
Grease. Big John Travolta fan. Can you do the dance?
No, I can't. But I love that. I've watched that movie more than any other movie.
It's a fun one. If you could see one band or musical artist live, passed away or living, who would it be?
The Beatles.
The Beatles. That's a good choice right there.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite non-Christian book?
Martin Buber, I and Thou.
What is it about it that you like?
It's German. He's a Jewish German. It's one of the greatest relational existential writings in history. A great philosophical study. Ich und du in German. It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
It's good. Maybe I'll dive into it. I tried reading some books like I tried reading Dostoevsky one time. I tried reading The Idiot, and I felt like an idiot trying to read it. So it was
those Russians. They go on. They put you on a train and they start going across Siberia, and it lasts forever.
Last rapid fire question, and I feel like I can say this because I'm from Buffalo. What does it feel like to be a Chicago sports fan?
Okay, first of all, I got to say, I'm a Cleveland Guardians fan because my son works for the Cleveland Guardians. So I can dispense with worries about the Cubs. The Bulls are not very good, and I don't pay attention to the NBA, so I don't care. We like to watch Northwestern's basketball team. They're fun to watch. They're not very good this year. The Chicago Bears are not very good. And I'd rather watch the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah. Oh, no, 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 no. Don't say that. Oh,
Yeah, I like to watch the teams that are really playing well. I enjoy watching football. And I can watch any good game. And I don't mind I'll read while I'm doing it. But Chris is no fan of pro football. She puts up with it because I watch it during the fall. But the Chicago sports teams right now are not very good. And that's okay because I can cheer for the Guardians and I can cheer for good college football, college basketball. We get to watch, basically, we all get to watch anything we want these days. So,
yes, we do. And I will always accept you over in the Bills Mafia. So come on over, cheer for Josh Allen. Well, hey, thank you so much, Scott, for being on this episode of Creating Space, where we're creating space for compelling conversations. If people would like to find you or follow you, is there any place that people can connect with you or even just stay in touch with, hey, what's coming out next? What's going on?
And I have a Substack, Scot McKnight Substack, and I have a Blue Sky account, which is the one that I favor right now. But my Substack is where I do my work. That's where you can keep up with me.
Well, we will place a link in our show notes for your Substack. I would highly recommend following along. I get an email Monday through Friday with your Substack and love seeing what it is that you're writing about or looking into or books that you're reviewing. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It was a joy getting to hear from you and learn from you about the new perspective on Paul. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into this episode of Creating Space. If you've not yet subscribed to the podcast, please do so. Please like it, share it with others. Let people know about the conversation that is happening here on Creating Space. We drop a new episode on the first Thursday of every month. So stay tuned for our next episode and let others know about this one right here. Let's learn together about different perspectives and ways of viewing the scriptures. Let's continue to create space and grow together in this community. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back with you on the first Thursday of next month.